Hello, everybody, and welcome to the panel on ecology, economy, and the law, shifting the power over paradigm. And as you may have seen from the schedule, the plan was that Friday the talks here were on the subject of soil. Yesterday they were on soul, and today on society. And of course, the real challenge in our soul work that we've been working on over the last 24 hours is that if we really believe that we're all one and we're all in this great spiritual adventure together, then we get to test that by trying to work with other people, often other people who have very different perspectives from us, and shift things collectively at the social level. There we go. Third time lucky. So over the next 105 minutes, you're going to be hearing about some of the ways in which these incredible folks sitting to my right have been engaging with that and undertaking that work in their own journeys, trying to shift society, and of course, hopefully, some of the ways in which it might inspire you on your own journeys and your own shifting. I myself am Shaun Chamberlin. My work goes under this name of Dark Optimism. I quit my job in 2005 in response to the general unfolding omnicide of the world and trying to figure out what on earth I might do about it. I've been involved in climate policy activism, helped to co-found the Transition Towns movement and the Ecological Land Cooperative, involved in founding a couple of communities, been arrested with Extinction Rebellion, written books and films, so I've been trying from all sorts of different angles to figure out how we might shift this awful path that we're collectively on, and I'm very excited to hear from these fine folk about some of the work that they've been doing to that end. So I'll be on the next panel, so I'm not going to talk much more myself here, but so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jojo Mehta. Her talk is going to be about changing the rules, stop ecocide and protecting the future of life on Earth. And Jojo is a barrister and worked alongside the... Sorry, I'm not a barrister. Jojo is not a barrister. I would like to make that very clear. Jojo worked alongside the barrister and legal pioneer Polly Higgins, and together they co-founded the Stop Ecocide campaign in 2017 to support the establishment of ecocide as a crime at the International Criminal Court. So since Polly's death in 2019, Jojo has coordinated the growing international team engaged in this highly focused mission and is chair of the board of the Stop Ecocide Foundation in the Netherlands, which now manages the campaign. Over to you, Jojo.
Thanks. Yeah, when Polly and I started this campaign, it was from these two different angles. I came from environmental campaigning, and she came from the legal side. So that was the dynamic, if you like, that was there at the beginning of this campaign. A lot of people, different countries around the world, people understand more or less what one means when one says ecocide. If you were to go to France, where the president recently, President Macron recently voiced support for making ecocide an international crime, they would be very familiar with the term as implying mass damage and destruction of the natural world. On the other hand, sometimes I have conversations with people in the US who literally don't know where to start with the definition, and of course there's everything in between. So we use the word ecocide to mean essentially mass damage and destruction of ecosystems. So serious, widespread or systematic harm to nature that is committed with knowledge of the risks. And that is something that has been happening over decades, as we all know, committed by some of the biggest corporations in the world consistently. And I mean, we'd even go so far as to say that, you know, the global economy right now is based on two things. It's based on debt, and it's based on ecocide. It's based on destruction of nature and those kind of extractive practices that continue to treat nature as an infinite resource on a finite planet. So we already know what the costs are of that. We've seen what's happening. We know what the costs are to the earth. We know what the costs are to the climate. We know that those who are most exploited have least to do with this happening and are suffering the most, whether that's the climate vulnerable islands that our campaign's been working with specifically, whether that's other countries in the global south where the resources are being exploited by the wealthy north. But we also have solutions. There are, in the world of farming, in the world of energy, in the world of renewable resources, of circular economy. There are plenty of solutions out there, regenerative farming, all of these elements, some of which you've probably been hearing about over the course of this weekend. But we're clearly not seeing things moving fast enough in the right directions. You know, we're still on as a society, you know, heading for the brink. So why does Ecocy continue, given that we have all of this knowledge? From our perspective, it is simply because it's allowed to. So as a CEO, as an investor, effectively, I mean, particularly CEOs, they have an obligation, they have a duty to maximise return for shareholders. That is effectively, in the UK and many other parts of the world, that is the legal duty of the CEO of a company. But they can only do that within what is legally permitted, in the sense that you can't get insurance if what you're planning to do is kill a few hundred people in order to make your profit, because that's against the law, that's a crime. But mass damage and destruction of the natural world is, in most places in the world, largely permitted. You can get a permit for oil extraction, for fracking, for mining, and so on. So it's not beyond that line, that moral line. Now, we use laws in the sort of dominant Western culture. We use laws, criminal laws, as a way of drawing the moral line. So murder is a crime. We know it's wrong to kill someone. Now, I'm sure everybody in this audience, and most people I ever speak to, understand serious destruction of nature to be criminal. But actually thinking about whether it's a crime or not is something that most people haven't actually sort of gone into thinking about. And in fact, most people, many people, think of law as something over there that lawyers do. And international law is something that's even further away. And international criminal law, you know, might as well be on Mars for how much it feels like, you know, we can potentially have any influence on that. So what I think that means is that there's not a huge understanding of what the mechanisms are for changing those laws. And Polly Higgins, who I worked with very closely until her death last year, spent the last decade of her life dedicated to one particular route for doing this. And I often say that, you know, our campaign is very much a kind of a one-trick pony. It's literally trying to do one specific thing, which is to make ecocide an international crime at the International Criminal Court. Now, Nature is clearly determined to make sure that you all get to see what we're doing, because blowing the flyers in amongst the audience. So I think take that as a hint and put one in your pocket. And feel free to come up and, you know, grab any materials you feel like from the table. So the way that this is possible is by any state, it doesn't have to be more than one state, but it's ideally more than one state, proposes at the International Criminal Court to amend the document that governs international law, international criminal law, and that's called the Rome Statute. It's the most powerful legal document in the world, arguably. And it only takes one state to propose that amendment, and then you require 2/3 of the member states to agree to it for it to become law. That's obviously in an absolute nutshell. There are actually stages to the process. But what that means is it means interacting with governments, and it means interacting with diplomats and lawyers and researchers to move that forward. And that's what our campaign does. But we also have a public campaign. And one of the reasons for that is that until a few years ago, it was considered too risky or too extreme for traditional funders to look at or to support. And many in NGOs, including some of the big environmental NGOs, felt it to be too risky. It's not the kind of campaign where, you know, you can save, you know, this many elephants in this many months by doing this, you know, whereas a simple kind of trajectory. It's much more unpredictable than that, because you're dealing with politicians and governments. And the ultimate result is not in your control. But what we realized was that there were an awful lot of people, of ordinary people, who could recognize that actually just making it illegal to engage in this destruction is a really simple and obvious route to take. And so we ended up creating this public campaign where people could sign up, join, help to fund what we're doing, which is, I mean, I sometimes describe us as kind of the good twin of the evil corporate lobbyists. Effectively, what we're doing is all about connecting people and getting people in the right rooms and at the right forums. So we spent 3 years with small Pacific islands, supporting them to come to the International Criminal Court where they had a vote and where they were able to potentially take this forward, but it literally hadn't crossed their radar to do that, or their finances to do that, and we supported them to do that. To the extent that at the end of last year, 2 Pacific Island states actually stood up at the International Criminal Court and asked for ecocide to be seriously considered, to be added alongside war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, which are considered the most serious crimes in the world. And sometimes people say to us, well, are you putting destruction of nature alongside genocide? You know, how dare you do that? And then when you look at the perspective of it and you say, well, actually, we continue down this ecocidal route. We're not just talking about one people extinguishing another people. We're talking about the entire species. So yes, we are categorizing it as an atrocity crime alongside those crimes. Okay, thank you. Shaun's keeping us all to time. So nothing like being interrupted if you're losing your thread. No, it's all right. Don't worry about it. But what we've realized over the last year is that there was, if like a missing ingredient in terms of having that conversation grow at the international level. So Polly talked about it for a decade. I worked with her for 5 years. There were many people who very much, admired what she was saying, thought it was very inspiring, but it wasn't considered a realistic approach. Then, over the last year to 18 months, we've seen the mass mobilizations of Extinction Rebellion, of Greta Thunberg's inspired school strikes, so the Fridays for Future movement. And we would say that as a direct result of that, the conversation, the sort of window in which people can talk about the climate and ecological emergency that's happening has grown hugely. So the whole conversation around ecological emergency and around climate crisis has now become living room conversation. It's now, there's a window where politicians are talking about it, where the media is talking about it. And what we've found as a result is that people can suddenly hear what we've been saying for years. And so we've seen a massive acceleration in this movement, both in terms of people coming to join us and talking about it, but also at the concrete political level of moving this forward at the international level. And the two things are very connected, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But so we had these islands standing up in December at the International Criminal Court and saying, we want this crime to be considered. And that brought the conversation for the first time in 50 years, brought it onto the international stage. Then a few months ago, we had President Macron sort of cornered, if you like, by his own citizens' assembly, which just shows the power of getting the voice of the people involved. They voted for a crime of ecocide, 99.3%. And there were a lot of green votes in local elections. And that kind of cornered the president, if you like, into having to be positive about it and actually speak out in favour. And literally within 2 weeks, we had Belgian Green Party proposing ecocide into the Belgian government, and that is about to be discussed. Also this year, we've had the Swedish trade union movement come out in favour of ecocide, asking their own government to move forward with it as a crime. So we're starting to see, it's gentle right now, but it is accelerating. We are starting to see a snowball effect where this concept is really starting to take root at the state level. And that's incredibly exciting. And I actually spoke on this stage last year briefly, encouraging people to support us getting to the point where the island states were prepared to step up. They've now done that, more quickly than we thought was possible. And now other states are really starting to come on board. And what's really making the difference in that is obviously the more states get involved and the more politicians talk about it, the more other politicians listen. But also it's a question of changing the conversation at the grassroots level as well. Because we know that we don't have time for the entire world to get behind our specific campaign. Obviously that'd be wonderful, but what we do know is that this concept of ecocide as a criminal act, concept of ecocide as mass damage and destruction, is something that can enter general conversation. And as that word becomes more and more widespread, that conversation gets louder, and then politicians start to listen. And we're already seeing that happen. So literally, even if you just take a placard, take a picture of yourself with it, put it on your social media, go to our website, look at the different things you can do to support this in terms of a conversation in your own networks. It may feel small, it may feel, it may not feel like it's, up there at the international level, but it all makes a huge difference, because there are so many environmental campaigns out there, so many NGOs that are dealing with this level of mass damage and destruction as part of what they do. And if all of those people simply started to use the word ecocide to describe it, this becomes a whole kind of powerful conversation. And I also believe that it has a kind of a bridging effect. It's a kind of missing piece, if you like. I mean, can you imagine campaigning for human rights if it was still legal to torture people or to kill people? It'd be really hard. But actually, environmental campaigns are kind of doing that. They're operating on top of a missing, there's a law that isn't there that should be to take that forward. And that kind of allows you to, there's a kind of reconceptualization that is able to happen with that. Because if you put the destruction of nature alongside the destruction of human beings, and Paul's going to go on to talk about how, our legal system, I think, about how our legal system currently is very anthropocentric. It's very focused on people. But once you add destruction of nature in there, and people start to make those equations in their minds, okay, so damaging nature is actually as bad, and it's as important a consideration as damaging other people. You start to perhaps link to the fact that we are not separate from nature. And this is something that this festival, if any festival is going to focus on that, it's this one, is how connected the whole web of life is. And so, we see, this law as a kind of a bridging piece that's doable and achievable in the current system, but that can actively kind of start to change this. And actually that speaks to the title of Camilla's talk, where she talks about Trojan horses. It feels a little bit like a Trojan horse in that way, and potentially hugely powerful for really shifting, changing the conversation and shifting our perspective about how we relate to nature. I hope I've kept within my 15 minutes. So,
more if you want.
I mean, I suppose one thing that I did think of in relation to this festival in particular, I was recently watching, there was a little film that came out, I don't know if anybody saw it, called Living in the Time of Dying. I don't know if anyone saw that on social media, maybe, where there was a lot of focus on people, realizing what's happening around us in terms of the sixth mass extinction, in terms of what as a sort of dominant Western culture we have sort of done to the world and so on. But there was this fantastic elder speaking from one of the Native American tribes, and he was talking about, I love the way he described this. He said, we're told that we believe that we're born into paradise. You guys believe you've been kicked out. And that to me really kind of put a finger on one of the kind of deep cultural reasons for the Western sort of separation mindset from nature. And I think that one of the things that this law really speaks to is that connection that he was describing, the world that we're born into, the nature, the paradise of nature on Earth as it should be able to thrive, is something that we've been born into and need to protect. But also because, we're part of that, the whole concept of Mother Earth and so on, but also the concept of consequence, that there is if you damage the Mother Earth, there is a consequence, and that's something that the indigenous cultures believe very strongly the world over. And so for me, the Ecocide law is a way of bringing that concept and that attitude into the dominant legal paradigm. And so that to me felt very powerful, and just that kind of realization that we shouldn't be feeling ourselves to be exiles from the beautiful world that we're born into, but that we should protect it, and that there are consequences if we don't.
Thank you, Jojo. And you'll notice that I'm keeping people quite strictly to time. That's partly because we're trying to make sure there's space at the end for a conversation between people here, because you're going to hear some quite different perspectives. This was about kind of global legal interventions. We're going to be hearing about more national and local scale interventions. And so, yeah, we want to really get a vibe for how these things interact. So now I'm going to hand over to Paul Powlesland, who is a civil barrister, also an environmental activist and a storyteller who founded Lawyers for Nature, and is shaking up what it means to be a lawyer in this time of environmental crisis. No pressure, over to you. Get shaken.
Yeah, so one of the joys of the time of COVID is that I'm able to address you today in exactly the same outfit as I addressed His Honour Judge David Holland in the High Court last week, because in these days of, it's all done by laptop now, so this is literally what I wore for 3 days in the High Court, and nobody knew that secretly below the desk I was actually like this. So maybe I am shaking out what it means to be a barrister in this time, as well as expressing my disapproval for the current justice system by cocking a snook at them. So I'm going to go through briefly a sort of past, present and future of nature rights and the way in which the English legal system has reacted to nature rights and the policing of nature, if you like. And turning to the past, and this is something that I haven't necessarily used in talks before, but has been coming up for me a lot this weekend. In this country, we have a fundamental disconnect from nature and from the land. And I think it's really important for us to look at where that disconnect came from, because there's a lot at this festival around indigenous cultures and the way in which they've been colonized and in many ways exterminated. But I do think we often ignore the colonization and the theft of the land that we in this country have suffered. For 1,000 years ago, William the Conqueror came over, effectively killed people, stole all the land, took it for himself, gave it to his cronies. And that might seem like ancient history, but the weird thing is, and the thing we just don't really talk about anymore, is that they've mostly still got it. And obviously there's a whole history which I have to basically praise, but you then go through things like there was one of the things that made that, and also enslaved the people in the form of feudalism, where you had to basically work on someone else's land in order to live and feed yourself. And the only thing that made that even bearable was the commons, where you could at least graze your animals and things like that. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, the people in power, which was a tiny, tiny fraction who actually in Parliament managed to get laws passed that basically got rid of all the commons, stole the land even more, and then forced your ancestors to go and work in factories just to keep themselves going. And we are a direct descendant of that, such that now we're in a system where over half the land in this country is owned by 1% of the population. And where to even get that basic human need of coming and connecting in nature, you have to pay someone who holds thousands of acres £180 for a ticket just to come and sit in nature. And I think whilst we're concentrating on all these indigenous people around the world who've been colonized, maybe we should perhaps look at ourselves and say, well, is this not a form of that? Open question. Now, the reason that relates into what controversial. The reason that relates, I suppose, into what I want to say is that fundamental disconnect from nature, I think, is one of the reasons that we have a lot of environmental destruction in this country. People are very disconnected from nature. But it also goes towards what the English legal system prizes above all else. And Jojo said that our current system is anthropocentric. It looks to humans, but actually I don't think it really does. My experience of the English legal system, it looks to property. That is its holy grail. That's what it's there to protect. Property and power. And every time I go into the High Court arguing for the rights of protesters, or saying maybe you shouldn't just destroy loads of rivers and pour shit into rivers and destroy trees, they're like, well, very interesting, Mr. Powlesland, but what about property rights? You know, that's it every bloody time. It's all about property rights, and that is what they are there to protect. And tiny bit of history, I won't bore you too much. But there was a very influential legal scholar called William Blackstone who wrote the Commentaries on the Law of England, which basically formed the basis of legal education, and therefore, in many ways, the basis of how the English legal system works. And he wrote about property. The earth and all things herein are the general property of mankind, exclusive of other beings from the immediate gift of the Creator. So he was basically saying, God gave us all this stuff, all this inanimate nature, and we basically own it. And by we, he meant, of course, that tiny percent of the population who stole it 1,000 years ago. And that idea is, I think, possibly one of the most destructive ideas in the history of humanity. The idea that nature is a dead, inanimate thing that you can own. And the reason it's especially destructive, of course, is that that was written in the 18th century. And then because of English colonization, we then exported that idea around the world. So in many, across the world now, many of the battles you see between indigenous people and the system, this kind of current capitalist system, is about that idea of indigenous people seeing nature as alive, a being, Mother Earth, and this system seeing it as a dead thing to be economically exploited. And we actually help to export that, which is why I also think we should try and change that narrative and to bring about the rights of nature. So that's the past. Moving to the present. Why does this idea of nature being a dead, inanimate property right cause us problems? Well, I can give you some experiences of when I've been in court and the problems that has given to me. So, I don't know if many of you know, there's a dispute a few years ago in Sheffield where the city council tried to chop down thousands of trees. And lots of local people wanted to stop that. And they stood under the trees to try and stop that happening. And the council then went to get an injunction, which is based on property rights, saying, well, these are our trees and we can do what the fuck we want with them, so you can't stand underneath them. And I had to go and represent these protesters. And I tried to use human rights arguments, saying, well, they have a human right to protest, right? Everyone, and that should protect this nature, and it doesn't. Because the judge was like, well, if it's their human right to protest that you're concerned about, Mr. Powlesland, why can't they just go and protest just over there, away from the tree? And in human rights terms, he was exactly correct, because, of course, they've still got their right to protest. They can stand over there, 20 feet away, whilst they destroy the tree. They're still protesting about it because it's fucking pointless, because the tree then gets destroyed. And almost every time I'm in court arguing for nature or trying to protect nature, I just feel like I have my hands tied behind my back, because I can't actually talk about the root of things, which is stop fucking destroying nature. Like, nature is alive, nature is sacred, and we need to stop destroying it, because that argument is just seen as at worst, at best irrelevant, at worst kind of batshit crazy. And we see that then manifesting in our entire relationship to nature. For instance, rivers and the current, there's been in the news quite a lot recently. There's been huge amounts of sewage discharges into rivers because the water companies can't be asked to invest in any kind of decent treatment facilities. And if any of you on Twitter, you might want to follow Feargal Sharkey, who's the lead singer of The Undertones. Anyway, yeah, and he's basically a river campaigner now, and he basically just keeps posting about all these discharges and all this like pollution, and at the end of every tweet he's now got a little kind of motto where he's like, and the Environment Agency does what exactly? So the Environment Agency is supposed to be looking after it, basically do fuck all and just let this keep on happening. But because there's no rights for rivers, no one else can really do anything. And so we're just stuck in the situation where there's this constant destruction and no real way of pushing back on that. Which is quite sad. So, to stop this being too depressing, let's talk about the future and what rights for nature could look like and how we could actually shift this paradigm. Firstly, actually, and this is probably something I should have done at the start of a talk about rights of nature, I should probably define what rights of nature are. So I try. It's a quite hard thing to describe in a way that makes sense at midday on a Sunday morning after a heavy night. But I haven't said it yet. So the rights of nature can be broken down into two things effectively. You've got what's called standing, and then the actual content of the rights that nature can have. So the concept of standing means who is a legal person and who is considered a legal person by the legal system. So that means the person who can bring cases, who can be sued, and that kind of thing. So traditionally, back in the day, like sort of 2,000 years ago, the only people who had standing and rights were effectively middle-class white men, effectively rich white men. And over time, that category of people who have rights has expanded to include poor men and women and black people and children. And it's gone over and over. And we now basically got to the point where all of humanity has the right to sue and be sued and has some rights, but nature doesn't. So the standing thing is actually potentially quite key, because at the moment, all the battles for nature have to be fought sort of through activists. And you can't bring a case in the right of a tree. So if this tree here was going to be destroyed, you can't bring a case saying, oh, actually, this tree has a right not to be destroyed, because the court would say, well, actually, that isn't a thing. It's just a dead nothing, and it sits on this land, and therefore the landowner has the absolute right to basically do what the hell they want with it. So if we expanded the idea of standing that nature could sue and be sued, that would, I think, significantly change our relationship with nature. And then the other thing is what the actual content of those rights would be. And that's an open question. And actually, it's something I haven't even I don't think anyone has really fully decided what those rights would be yet. And it's an interesting question even to start imagining what that would be. And it's a conversation we need to have. Because obviously we can't necessarily say that trees should never be chopped down, because they're quite useful for humans and that might be quite needed. But equally, the current rampant destruction of trees is obviously wrong. I guess the key thing I would say on this is that we don't necessarily know what the rights of nature are yet, but we do know what the wrongs of nature are, and that's maybe a good place to start. In the same way as we haven't actually figured out fully what the rights of people of colour should be in terms of equality. You know, that's still being fought in America as we speak. But 200 years ago, some people knew that slavery was wrong, and it's been a gradual process since then trying to figure out what the actual rights should be. And that's the process I want to start with nature. So we know, for instance, just going and chopping down a 300-year-old oak for no reason, probably wrong. We know that pouring raw sewage into rivers, probably wrong. And we can start from there and then gradually work out what the detailed rights of rivers should be. I'm just going to give you one quick example as well. This is from the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Rivers, which is an online example. How long have I got, by the way? Okay. Which is an example. Obviously, this doesn't have any legal effect, but an example that's been drafted to show what kind of thing this would be. There's a long preamble, which I don't have time to give you, but these are the basic rights. So this treaty establishes that all rivers shall possess, at minimum, the following fundamental rights: the right to flow, the right to perform essential functions within its ecosystem, the right to be free from pollution, the right to feed and be fed by sustainable aquifers, the right to native biodiversity, and the right to restoration. So all of you can see there, perhaps, that those things are quite wide and not necessarily particularly well defined, but we could, by having that, begin to start this process of imagining what those rights would entail and how we actually want to have a sustainable relationship with our rivers. The thing I want to end on about the future, and this is maybe a kind of ideally a hopeful, empowering message, is looking at the nature of rights historically. Because I think there's far too much of a sense of people waiting for these rights to be handed down from on high, to wait for our government to give these rights. But frankly, if we're waiting for the UK Parliament, especially in its current form, to pass a Rights of Rivers Act 2024, I think we're going to be fundamentally disappointed. They're not going to be doing it anytime soon. But, and this is the hopeful part, if you actually think of what rights are throughout time, the most powerful rights are usually not those handed down from on high. They're rights that are declared by people who have the gumption and the power to stand up and then defend those rights, even though they had no legal meaning at first. So we take the American Revolution. When the American Declaration, when they declared those rights at first, that was actually completely illegal. And the British Crown said, no, that's not the current legal system, doesn't how it works. But they stood up and fought for them, and therefore they became those rights. When Gandhi stood up and said, actually, we have these rights in India, the British colonial authorities were like, no, you don't, mate. But he stood up for them and fought for them, and then those became the rights. And the most powerful legal revolutions usually happen in that way. And that is really where I believe the rights of nature are going to happen in this country. It's people like you basically saying, I believe these trees and this river should have these rights, literally declare them. It has absolutely no legal effect in this country whatsoever, but is an incredibly powerful thing to do. Actually, say it has no legal effect, and I'll give you one example why that's not true. Effectively, going back to the Sheffield case, in Sheffield, they basically declared in a way that these trees have rights and you're not going to destroy them. And under the current legal system, the council had the absolute right to take them. The law says you can destroy 17,000 trees. But 10,000 local people formed a group and were like, no, you're not. You're not going to do that. And the council, oh, yes, we are. And then they literally got the police, they got security guards, they got the most powerful injunction ever granted in England, which basically made it a criminal offence, punishable by 2 years imprisonment, to stand under a tree peacefully. Yeah, but okay, I'll finish up with this one. But the people did not give up. They said, no, these trees are staying. And some people nearly went to prison, and actually they won. Because the law said, actually, we probably can't put 1,000 middle-class people in prison for standing under a tree. And so, although the law said that these trees didn't have rights, the practical power with those protesters said they did. And they won. Yeah, exactly. Woo! And I really want to say that lies with all of you. You can, sorry, can I finish off? Yeah. You can all do that. You can find your local river and say, I love this river. I see this river as sacred. This river has these rights, and I'm going to defend it. And if that means I go to prison for peacefully doing something, I go to prison. You all have the power to do that, which means you all have the power to create rights of nature. And I really urge you to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So we've heard from Paul about the enclosures and the colonization that we've seen of our land and our mines here in the minority world. And then, of course, we've gone and, well, not exported, but imposed that on the rest of the world. And so Camila's going to tell us a bit more about how that has happened, but also how it is now happening. Camila Moreno works with social movements in Brazil and Latin America on social and environmental dimensions of biotechnology and agribusiness expansion in those regions, with a focus on the territorial impacts of development policies and emerging schemes associated with the green economy. So over to you, Camila.
Can you tell me when I pass 10 minutes?
Certainly.
Okay, so I want to start testing your programming. If you see something that doesn't look right, have you heard this? See it, say it, sort it. So you are good programming. I mean, when I was coming to here from the airport, this was like some big brother, you know. See it, say it, sort it. We will sort it out. Just text us, text the police, of course. So welcome to surveillance capitalism, no? So I want to start because the name of my talk was the digitalization of capitalism, if I'm not mistaken. And remembering some closer, okay, about what is this fourth industrial revolution and the digital transformation of society. There is completely and profoundly, and I believe, and I'm afraid of, irreversibly changing the way we work, the way we educate ourselves and our children, how we find a mate, how we shop, how we do commerce, how we transport, you know. For people, I don't know how popular is Uber in UK, no, but in Brazil it has destroyed all the struggle for public transport. Now, if you can pay just a little cents of more just to share Uber, and then the idea of on demand, that you can just have the power and just click and sort your life out individually without having to negotiate and to build movements. This is very strong. But most importantly, how this digital world has give a new meaning to what our own identity, and I would dare to say consciousness, because in my understanding, what the Silicon Valley is actually selling, it's consciousness itself. All the gadgets are just the mean through what they are feeding back to us, and we are very willing to, to enter into this crazy circle. So I'm happy not to be a digital native. I actually finished university typewriting. No, this is kind of saying how old I am. And I'm up to today. I don't have never had any social media nor Facebook. And so I kind of excluded from a lot of things. And people say, oh, you are crazy because you're kind of losing professional opportunities because you are not self-promoting yourself. So far, I don't have it, no. I don't know how to judge this, but I find always very weird when I'm exposed to the culture, because I look like with ethnographic eyes, as if I'm looking this kind of weird natives who build their story through Instagram, through filters, and the way that they post, and when everybody needs to post about something because this is the fashion way to be and to get some virtue signaling that you are going in the right direction. I find this very interesting in terms of observing the cultural change. So the alignment and the vertical integration that is going on in the world, I cannot stress enough how unique this is in the course of human history. Because we have had, among different civilizations, and especially since we started to build this world system, that it started from the 1500s on with the incorporation of the other lands to the Eurocenter, we never had some synchronized and mandatory top-down template that is like a mega cookie cutter that is defining how our future, our common future is going to be. And this is, I refer to the smart mandate, that we need to be smart, that everything it's better if it's smart. And I like this writer, I don't know if I pronounce his name correctly, Harari, is this Yuval Harari, who wrote at the beginning of the COVID madness an article for the, I think, Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, about how actually COVID is like this unique and almost sounds like engineered, opportunity to just fast forward all the trends that were already there. And among those trends, one that scares me the most is how normal the entire gamification of our mind, the colonizing of our imaginary is running on. I'm going to give you an example of, I follow a lot the corporate world and how they are like dealing with this giant opportunity that is going to be the great reset after, this first phase. And one of the things is to prepare the next generation workforce. Workforce to where? To factories like in Manchester? No, for giant warehouse. I mean, they are imaginary sees people like in IKEA corridors, like warehouse, like the Amazon, just roller skating with some glasses where they just look and visualize the things that they need to send to be delivered, by drones or by, the deliver people, the Dalits, as I call it, because as the new Dalits that were also, there's a very good movie by, what's this British filmmaker that made Bread and Roses, Ken Loach, about this whole delivery thing. I recommend it. But also for agriculture. Within the FAO, that is holding next year a World Conference on Food Systems, the big thing is the digitalization of agriculture. And they have this whole package to sell to the younger generations in the South, especially in Latin America and Africa, that nobody wants to be a farmer anymore. I know for you it can sound very weird because here is super fashion, super hipster, super transformative. But in the South, is the worst thing you can be is to be a farmer, because the entire development narrative is you need to leave the countryside because that's backwardness. You need to migrate to the cities. But now, and I'm coming from the kingdom of agribusiness and mechanized, delirium thing, Brazil, even with the small farmers and the medium farmers, it's all again, no, now technology will come with self-driving tractors, with drones, and with those glasses that is very seductive, because we have a generation that has been raised up playing the Candy Crush and the now Minecraft, and all of those games, they are designed using the most sophisticated, addictive technology based on Las Vegas, everything to just wire your mind to see life and interaction as game, where you make points and you are, above all, in war against something. So I've seen demonstrations, that Monsanto has been bought by Bayer, the giant, health corporations of Germany. So in Brazil, they say if it's Bayer, it's good. I don't know how is the logo here, but Bayer is playing super heavily into this kind of, selling off the stack. Well, and just to one more colorful anecdote about this, I did a course in Sweden some 5 years ago, and Stockholm hosts a lot of game design, super well-known offices. And the guy I was interviewing, he said that just having some beers, that the main purpose of the game industry, in his view, and he's very successful, is to transform the elements of the hero journey. And for those who are familiar with storytelling and all the mythical archetypes and the Jungian psychology, etc., is how actually somebody comes to be, the history of your journey, your personal journey. And they want to transform that into a consumer journey. So actually transform every human being at its core as a consumer, that can relate to the world as one big trade show. So this entire new socializing structures and vision for the future, I'm afraid to say how it's being downloaded, mostly and more structured through international climate policy. I've been following climate policy for a decade and a half, and I know Farhana from there. She is there much before me. But because I'm following closely and participating in the COPs and the meetings as part of our Brazilian government before, and I had this open policy for the delegation for transparency, so you could see. And actually, once you have a complex and very real issue of climate change, you reduce it to carbon metrics and carbon accounting, and you are creating this global governance regime around something you cannot see, you cannot touch, you cannot smell, and you cannot feel, that is an intangible molecule of carbon. How can you tell people that you have reduced your emissions, or that you're carbon negative, or you are neutral? Because you are relying on the same glasses, on the sensors, on the drones, on this huge infrastructure that is the digital infrastructure, but is being put in place in the name of fighting climate change. You don't have to believe me. You can just go into the UNFCCC website and check what are, and in the Climate Action Hub, what kind of projects are enlisted there, and judge by yourself how technology plays the part, and how, 5 minutes more, and what we call, or we define as a local struggle, or the local solutions for climate change, are being erased out of the picture. Because again, we are running on a very deep programming, as see it's sorted, say it's sorted, that we have a competitive advantage being on the South, that we can, because our currency is different than yours, if we sell something in euros or in dollars, of course, more money will flow for us. And what we are being programmed to sell is carbon. I could not tell in detail, because we have a limited amount, how the profound changes you are seeing about the Amazon and this thing about burning the Amazon. Yes, the Amazon is burning, but it's burning to open the way to get public land and to get a process of land grabbing to grow soy that everybody's eating here, soy burgers, soy milk, soy spread. Don't eat soy. Oh, bananas. Eat your fruit in the morning. Yes, I saw out there very nice Indian food, but I saw Chiquita banana brand. Chiquita is narco traffic, is drug dealing, is Caribbean and Central America. It's like the worst. And here is, I must tell you that I find very weird, this kind of shifting, how a narrative needs to be. We need to have this conversation. Why you don't have local food here? Where is the local food? You don't produce local food? Yeah. So I think it's the basic, food and seeds, the basic thing. So, again, about something that also calls me attention. I keep reading the reality, and this oat, show me your numbers. This is very famous also in Berlin, where they say, hey, Bundestag is where the Angela Merkel is now. Show me your numbers. Again, we're relying in the metric that you yourself cannot count. You rely on the technology to prove. And agroecology movement in Brazil is struggling itself to prove that is better at sequestering carbon than the agribusiness, because of course they can hire the best drones and the best consultants to prove that their soy it's better than anything else. So because the time is finished and I'm really looking forward to the debate among us and to listen to Farhana, I urge you to question where these two major values of transparency and traceability they came from and how they are becoming universal values. Because traceability is it's an important issue. If you are importing your food from elsewhere, when you cannot just meet your local producer and see what's going on. So if you're relying in foreign trade to bring things from far away, you actually rely on your QR code and the truth that is going to be revealed. But if you shift that and look around and visit and go where food is being grown, you don't need the traceability. And about transparency, there's a lot of people talking about how the architecture of transparency and this fetishism around glass and steel, and the greenhouse is the biggest metaphor for that. I hope we can talk more later, but this, again, it's as we see it from the South, it's very problematic because we are normalizing this idea that we are all individuals, a community that needs to be seen through. And when you see through, like we are in the mud, and when you think of a protective structure in the South, it's usually a mud house, a wood hut, or straw. You don't have to be open to all. You have the space that you need to nurture, and then you can warm it up. And this idea of a world made of glass, it's the world, the real world made of glass we are heading to is the world of screens and of a seamless capitalism where just you touch and everything is there, and you are being reflected in that and not on yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Camila. So we've been hearing about some of these issues of globalization, global law, national law, and now I think Farhana's going to bring us back down to the local level somewhat. So Farhana is an interesting combination of an international environmental lawyer and a climate activist. She's the founder and CEO of Track Zero, coordinator of Camden Think and Do, and a senior advisor at Systemic. And she's going to talk to us about Think and Do, creating local, ecological and economic hubs. Farhana.
Thank you. And thank you to my fellow panelists for fascinating talks. I wish we all could talk for longer. thank you also to this festival and to the panel organisers who put this panel together. It's called Ecology, Economy and the Law, Shifting the Power Over Society. And so today is, I think, devoted, as you said, to the society part a little bit more than the other themes that we've been touching on. I'm going to use my 15 minutes, and please do, ping me at sort of 10, 12 minutes or something. That'd be good. I'm going to tell my own story a little bit of how I came to be here, not just today, but how I came to be in this country. My life as a mother, my life as a migrant, as a Muslim, and my life as a lawyer, which I have been for now 31 years almost, mainly advising the small island states. So I've been a legal advisor to around 5 different countries over that period. I've actually advised them, for 30 years almost continuously in the climate change negotiations, which started in 1989 and resulted in the first treaty being agreed at the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio, where I was also present when we were trying to get a forest convention and Agenda 21. And I know this is very Brazilian, and Brazil rose up then and said, we're not going to have our forest made subject to an international treaty. So I go back quite a long way, but I guess my trajectory is understanding the limits of the law from a young 18-year-old who wanted to use the law. And, I was going to be the lawyer that helped my community. I lived very near Brixton at the time. I worked in Brixton Community Centre. I was going to go and specialise in housing and tenancy law and employment law and work on social justice, essentially, issues, which have not, been mentioned as much, which are part and parcel of the way in which we approach everything. And I thought that, you could use law. Law, I saw it essentially as a tool, a very powerful tool to get justice for individuals, to give them protection against the powerful, to help communities who are fighting back. I guess I didn't, see how limited that was, how powerful actually the underlying operating systems of society really were, the underlying operating systems of capitalism were. And I feel I really want to say where I am now, which is not that I didn't know and understand about white supremacy as a migrant and as an immigrant, as a young child growing up in this country. When I came here at the age of 9, I was, bullied and racially harassed, and my family was, called Paki the whole time. So there's painful memories, but it's believing in a multicultural, multiracial, multilateral society. All these M's was a very powerful force for me, thinking that we could use politics, that we could use law, that we could use our expertise, that we could speak to power, and that we could tame power, and we could get a more just society. And I guess the frustration that I feel right now is actually those structures are too powerful for us to change through law. Greta sort of nailed it. She often says things very brilliantly. You can't change this rule. If you can't change the rules are there, and they will replicate essentially the system. You can't use them to change the system. You have to use other things to do that. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about. You have to use other forms of power. You have to use power that you've invented yourself. If you speak to power, use power, speak to the powerful, use the present system of power, you will never escape the system. You will replicate it. And that's what some of the things that unfortunately we've done through some of the processes that I've been involved in. So I was part and parcel of the negotiations of the climate treaty in 1992. I was a senior advisor and strategist that helped create the very carbon markets in the Kyoto Protocol, which set up emissions trading internationally, which created something called the Clean Development Mechanism, which then was translated, including by me. I was the lead advisor to the EU when we created the EU emissions trading scheme to bolt on essentially Kyoto and translate that into European law. And I have been a key player in in the Paris Agreement. And for me, the most important positive achievement in that agreement, there are two elements, is the inclusion of the goal of phasing out all emissions from greenhouse gases by mid-century. It doesn't quite say that, but basically now we've made everybody in the world believe that Paris equals the phase out of emissions by 2050. It doesn't actually say that, but that's what we've done. And that's what the science that 5 years ago demanded, that the 1.5 degree temperature limit demanded a global phase out somewhere near that time frame. The other thing that's in that treaty, which is talked about less, but which you'll hear more and more about, is a provision on loss and damage. So loss and damage has been a hugely controversial legal concept, which was originally put forward by the small island states in 1991. And at that time, they said they disguised it. We disguised it as insurance, because we knew very well that if we put in loss and damage and liability, it would never get through. So the 1992 convention contains provisions to set up insurance mechanisms, preventative and paying out mechanisms that would pay out in the result of damage being caused. But actually at that time, we had thought that we would be able to prevent the kind of massive chaos, the kind of chaos that you're seeing right now. So that provision is there. There's an exclusion of legal liability in there, but I think it shows, I'm highlighting it because it shows actually the small islands, the 100 vulnerable countries who emit between them about 0.3% of global emissions. It's not that they've given up on law and global frameworks, it's that they're recognizing the reality of where they are. And this is what ties in with some of the now realization that they also need to highlight and maybe pursue criminal strategies. I'm going to be very honest and say I don't have much faith in the International Criminal Court. It's, again, replicating a racist system of justice, which is what happens, actually, if you don't undertake thorough decolonization. The ICC does not, the International Criminal Court does not have the confidence anymore that anything other than black leaders and black people will be prosecuted, which is what's happened in the last 10 years. So it's lost massive faith. The other multilateral treaties that have also been destroyed are the WTO. You may think that's a great thing, but actually what you're now getting is a sort of lawlessness of very, very powerful individuals who control a very small number of people control all the digital technologies, and they want to take them out of all legal regulation whatsoever. So you're seeing a destruction of the human rights framework, you're seeing a destruction of the Bretton Woods Agreement, you're seeing a destruction of the climate treaty, you're seeing a treaty that took the Paris Agreement 10 years to negotiate, basically, which it will be an attempt to destroy it through the US guaranteed withdrawal of it from the 4th of November of this year. So you're seeing a massive assault, including by the most powerful, on these global frameworks that have taken over a century to sort of put in place, which, as I agree with Camila, they replicate, some of the very core injustices, and we must always be very aware of that. That the systems that were put in place don't necessarily give us the kind of rights, give us the kind of society that we're actually sort of seeking. So how do we do that? How do we create the kind of society which is kind to nature, which is recognizing and based on all of our humanity, and recognizing, and doesn't start off with just a handful of powerful countries, a handful of powerful people making decisions and putting them through, whether in the form of a law here or a law internationally. How do we do that? So I also took part in the protest last year as Extinction Rebellion, and one of the things about that movement is, it held, one part of it held a view of using the law very instrumentally, and using non-violent non-violent direct action to gain a change in laws or gain a change in certain things. And another part of that was very much interested in creating actions that were prefigurative, that were actually showing the kind of society that we want to live in. So the think and do experiment came from that second strand of thinking, from that second line of thinking that says, yes, it's great to participate in politics, it's great to participate in legal frameworks, it's great to go to court, it's great to use litigation, it's great to demand more at treaties and then negotiations, but at the same time we must always recognize that the foundations of the new world that we're building, the different kind of thinking that we're building, cannot necessarily happen in those processes. So you have to create your own spaces, you have to create radical inclusion in those places, and you have to hold back and not define all of the things that need to happen in those spaces until that task is done. And that's what the Think and Do space, which is essentially a disused shop. It was a cafe that had been shut on Kentish Town High Street for over a year, owned by Camden Council, who had still got the lease on it. And a number of us from the community suggested, why don't we have a shop where you buy nothing, but actually where you sit and have a community that discusses what kind of collaborative actions they want, and what can the council do to support that. So Camden Council, like many councils last year, again, riding on the back of all the rebellions that were taking place, Camden also declared a climate and ecological emergency. Camden held a citizens' assembly. It was the first council in the UK, and in fact the world, to actually hold a dedicated citizens' assembly process. And Camden's adopted now, as a bit delayed as a result of COVID, an action plan which is committed to a phase out by 2030, and is committed to rolling out these think and do spaces. And why think and do spaces? The words are deliberate. I sort of had a hand in pioneering that terminology. It's because every single one of us has to think and do something different from what we're doing right now. Every single one of us is a strategist and an implementer. This division that we have between our bodies and our minds, reflected in some people who get to do the thinking and the rest of us just get to do the doing, has to go. It's based on a lot of philosophical worldviews, which I haven't got time in the last few minutes to mention, but that's got to go, and you have to have an open space with an open agenda and welcome everyone in. We're also pioneering something which is tagging onto the hyper-local. So it's not even local. I mean, it's one step further than that. It's, again, what COVID is accelerating is a recognition that actually everything that we need should be within a 15-minute walking radius of our homes, wherever we live. We're going to reconfigure how we see spaces, not just as private and public, which relies on this distinction in law that came from the erasure of the commons. So large amounts of land were held as commons, and that is part of the history that Paul, I'm sure, knows a lot more about. But the idea of Think and Do is to recreate the commons, and to recreate the commons on our high streets, in our parks, on public pavements, to reclaim streets as public infrastructure that they are. And my pragmatic, legal, strategic hat is we're going to create the commons using assets that we already own. I don't have enough money to buy 1,000 acres and to share it with everyone. I'm annoyed. I already pay taxes that own the roads. I already pay taxes through to my council that owns huge amounts of commercial premises, as well as community centres, as well as hospitals. We own all of that stuff already. It belongs to us. And we now need to reconfigure and revision and repurpose all of those buildings and own them in common. And the way to do that, first of all, is to create the community. Every time you have a commons, there was already a governance structure, and essentially it was a tribe, a clan, a village that did that. And so you can't really reshape society, fundamentally, is my conclusion, without creating commons. And before you create commons, which will have very different legal rights than the one that we currently have. You have to create the communities, and to create communities, you need to open think and do spaces and welcome everyone in and start thinking and doing things differently from what you're doing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Farhana. And so what we're going to do now is not go into Q&A. We're going to do about 20 minutes of conversation between the panel. And what really struck me that came out of that was, if we don't have faith in the International Criminal Court, and we don't have faith in the capitalist overlords, and we don't have faith in the national governments, and we don't have faith in the robustness or justness of, the Paris Agreement and the international frameworks, then where can we put our efforts for a better world? Where is effective? One line from my late mentor, David Fleming, that really sticks with me is, large-scale problems do not require large-scale solutions. They require small-scale solutions within large-scale frameworks. And a lot of my work has been around building those frameworks for the diversity of small-scale solutions that we need. But for all of you, and this is more a conversation than a question to each of you, like, by all means talk to each other, but like, where feels to you like the fertile place to push for all of us who are trying to change the world in a way that would make it fairer and more ecologically sustainable and all the things that we want to see? I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that. Farhana?
Like, I guess, for me, land and soil and the connection with that is very profound. So I come from a family, and in fact, both my husband and I come from families that have literally been migrants for 3 generations. Me as a result of partition, him as a Jew through result of pogroms. So when you've disconnected with your land and you're a constant outsider, you realize how important and weighty all of that is. And I think creating that sense that wherever you are is important, learning and telling your story and the story of the land that holds you right now. This is where I am right now. I ended up in Camden, it's telling that story is really important. We have to tell all of the stories of all of us, and how this land, for example, resulted in me coming here. Essentially, the UK has invaded every single country in the world except 22 countries, So apart from those 22 countries, we're all connected to the story of this land. And learning that, I think, is really magical, and that's what I think is happening, that we can't just focus on global sort of campaigns and global things. We can't just do it nationally. We can't just do it locally. It's one set of stories, and we are still, before we get replaced by AI and robots, still really important for us to connect, and that trust is really important and is a real complement to the kind of campaigning and the NGOs, insiders, outsiders. I'm one of the insiders who's been in this sort of inside process. So I think we're getting rid of all of those distinctions is really helpful. And creating new tribes and discussing what those tribes looks like, discussing what the legal content of the rights of nature would look like here is a fantastic and wonderful opportunity that we can do.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'd like to come back around a couple of things. And I found myself agreeing with everybody on this panel on so many sort of key fundamental points. And one of the things that emerged, actually for me, funnily enough, I was just going to say, is the power of story that each of us in different ways have highlighted. And I think that's absolutely key. I would like to just highlight a couple of things that, I think it's very easy to fall into, kind of despair, or, kind of like, we can't change this and we can't change that and we can't change the other. We do change things. Paul was talking about how, activists and people changing the story of what they believe is right does ultimately end up changing the legal frameworks, which then does affect people's lives and what they can do. And that has, that's happened in the past. It happened with the conscientious objectors in the 20th century, who started off by being shot and jailed. And who then ended up winning the right to take a conscientious stance because there was a whole shift in the narrative, and society was then supporting that. And the same thing happened with homosexuals in the 20th century, and the same thing can happen in the 21st century with those who stand up to defend nature. I mean, we call them conscientious protectors, in our campaign. And XR's taken up that narrative a lot as well. And there's this sense that if we all describe those who are standing up to protect nature as conscientious protectors, and there are thousands and thousands of them, at what point is the old legal system willing to take on thousands of, in inverted commas, criminals, when in fact they're not seen as criminals, either by themselves or by anybody else? So there is a huge power in how we describe ourselves, how we tell those stories. And I also think it's worth pointing out that, for example, I think Farhana's absolutely right. I mean, there's a kind of saying around the ICC, around the International Criminal Court, that it never misses the opportunity to miss an opportunity, and that it's not been hugely effective. One of the things that we believe around amending it to include Ecocide is that actually it can restore it to some kind of relevance, because at the moment it's a court of last resort. Now, if you're a genocidal maniac or a war criminal, the likelihood of your own state prosecuting you is really quite small. So you're going to end up in the International Criminal Court. That is not something there's something very different around Ecocide law in that respect, because a country that ratifies ecocide as a crime has to apply it within its own jurisdiction. And the majority of people committing ecocide are actually corporations. So it's not heads of state necessarily. I mean, there may be heads of state. I can think of a couple that probably could and should be tried for ecocide. But largely speaking, it is corporations. And unlike, actually, I don't think there is such a thing as an average genocidal maniac, but let's say there was. Your average genocidal maniac doesn't care what people think of them. Your average CEO cares very deeply what people think of them, because it's public and investor confidence that actually make businesses work. And so if you're putting them in a position where they could have their asses on the line alongside a war criminal, that is not good PR. There's a whole, the story making around that is actually the most powerful thing about it. It's about creating a deterrent that can be enforceable by criminal law, and because that you create a sort of a shift then in the awareness of what is okay and not okay to do, which is why the narrative and the story around it is so deeply important. It's also why, and I know there's the partner of one of the lawyers that we work with closely, I think maybe in the audience today, we had this whole conversation around, lawyers have talked about if you were to adapt international laws to address what's happening to nature, would you, for example, extend crimes against humanity? Would you try and, fit it in some way to a framework that's already there? But what I'm realizing around this whole narrative question that's really emerged over the last few months is that no, it has to be that you add a crime of ecocide, because it's the actual word and concept around which the momentum grows, and how Extinction Rebellion very much have taken it on and have said we want to stop ecocide, and you see that discourse coming up with an Extinction Rebellion. It's now, as you may have noticed, also being taken up by Greta and Fridays for Future, who are talking about making ecocide a crime. It's something about the story around that, the concept that there is a wrong that is happening and has a name, that has the potential to shift that whole narrative. And so I think there are, and the other thing I wanted to bring in that comes again from listening to all of the others as well, is that I think this is that there's a real complexity here. I've noticed that the more I talk to other people in NGOs, people, diplomats, people in government, everybody, not everybody, but the vast majority of people are trying to do the right thing in their particular arenas. We're not talking about a kind of vast enemy that is both malicious and failing. It's like that's. I don't sort of see. Addressing, I see a lot of the people who I've communicated with in technology genuinely feel like they're doing the right thing, so it's like this is so much about how we communicate with each other and how we look at, and I think it again comes down to like the on the ground actually going and looking at things as well. I really resonated with that from both of you. And I just think that this is all hugely complex. It's not as simple as an us and them, or this is failing and this isn't. There's a lot of people really trying to do the right thing, and there are some amazing things that have come out of it. And that's what I think Farhana was highlighting with the 2050 net zero concept, that even though it's not strictly speaking in the black and white of the letters, everybody has understood it. How? Because of the story making around it. And so, I think there's a quite complex interplay of all these things. But the thing that seems to me to link it together is narratives.
Thank you. It's okay. Yeah, Paul?
So, how do we start to shift this? Who here has a piece of nature that they love, whether that's a river or a tree or a landscape? You love it, right? And love means that you would do whatever you can to protect it. And therefore, I think that's the overarching message here, that is within your power, even within the current legal framework. I want to give a very quick example. As well as doing all this legal stuff in the courts, what I actually think I almost love more is actually going out there and doing it on the ground. So about 3 years ago, I found a river in East London that was basically no one looking after it, completely polluted, covered in rubbish, no one there. And I moved there by myself and set up a community of people to restore that river. And there's now 7 boats there, and we all put time and money into restoring it. It's called Friends of the River Roading. And it's been a really powerful experience in a way that I couldn't have imagined, actually. And it's amazing what a difference it makes. That the law is exactly the same as it was 3 or 4 years ago in terms of how that river is regulated. But the whole way in which the river is perceived and is treated has changed. The Facebook group has 800 local people on it who are like, oh, wait a second, this is our river. And people believe in treating it sacredly. And my relationship with that river has changed. And I did a talk here a few months ago. I was just rambling online. And I suddenly said, in some ways it doesn't matter what the law is, because we love this river and we will do what it takes to protect her, regardless of the law almost. I was like, oh, wow, no, I really do love this river. And I would say, for all that nature that you put your hands up to say that you love, you need to start expressing that love in more than just, obviously it's great to go and swim and sit under trees and have ceremonies, but start expressing that in a practical protection of it, which is within all of your power to do, even in the current legal system. So I believe every river in the country should have a Friends of group, every woodland, every species. And genuinely, if I was to say, would I prefer to have, because by the way, there are huge legal frameworks already. Environmental law is massive. Most of it's not enforced because there's no one to enforce it. Would I rather have an act of parliament that gives rights to rivers that will probably be as ignored as last May's Parliament's declaration of a climate emergency, and indeed everyone's declaration of a climate emergency is basically ignored? Would I rather have that, a Rights of River Act, or would I rather have a group of committed citizens who love their river and love their nature out there now under the current legal framework, making a practical difference? Definitely that. And there's loads of stuff. I probably can't bore you now. And I can chat afterwards when you want some ideas, but there's lots of legal mechanisms you can currently use. And even if there aren't legal mechanisms, you can say, you're not polluting my river. I will physically and peacefully stop you doing that. And if you want to jail me for that, then so be it, because I love this. And I will fight for it. And that's why I believe all of you can make a practical difference now. You can decide to do that. You can say that my local tree has rights and enforce those. You can say your river has rights and enforce those. And I really encourage you to do so. And if you want to have chat in more detail about how you can do that, speak to me afterwards.
No, two points I want to touch. First, this idea of taking to courts. If I'm not mistaken, they tried to take Bolsonaro, our president, to the ICC on genocide and Amazon destruction. But as from Brazil, some people engaged in international campaigns may believe this, but we are very, very skeptical of this, because when you look, things are you cannot be that naive that to think, oh, Bolsonaro is evil, he wants to burn the Amazon with a whole bunch of landowners. No, the complex of soy. Just one monoculture. Soy occupies today in Brazil an area the size of Germany. It's 34 million hectares of GMO soy. You can fly over for 3 hours. You don't see any city. It's just giant fields and the corridors, the waterways and the dams to export that. So all the corporations in the world, all the traders, all the insurances, all the big law offices, all are involved because that's big business. I mean, think of the Chicago market exchange for soy, the futures market, all the financialization of the agricultural contracts, all kinds of tech that this is absorbing. Everybody is selling to Brazil. So today, what we export in terms of soy for Europe is ridiculous because our 60% of our soy, 50-something actually, it's going to China. Why it's going to China? Because China is developing. No, this weird thinking. Some developed, some are developing. We are getting there. We are not yet. We are imperfect form of something that is nice. I've been to China. I've written about China and Brazil and all that. And we go there, and they have the chicken nuggets. I always use the example of the chicken nuggets because the chicken nuggets, of course, it's not chicken. It's like everything coming out of killing the chicken, and then fried. And it's like the epitome. It's like the symbol that they are participating in this global culture, in this 4-district diet, in something nutritional, something that is correct. So even if we magically started to boycott all the soy that is coming to Europe to feed, to fuel, or the soy oil and everything, you have the entire Asia that is changing their food habits or in the nutrition because they are mimicking a way of living that we have sold as. And this is the problem with universality and one science and one nutritional science and this mandatory one way of thinking, because this is what pushes on the ground the monoculture. So it's not only corporations making money. It's an entire coherence of how we see as a society that comes about. Because we judge people, like I know a lot of friends who go to the Amazon and say, oh, indigenous people, they eat turtles. Oh, they eat monkeys. Oh, that's horrible. Yes, they hunt, and they kill a monkey, and they prepare the monkey. I don't like it, and you eat much less meat because it's prepared in a way that it gets in the fire for like almost a week, and so it's like in French they call faisandé. It's almost rotten thing. But it's appropriate there. They don't need to import an antibiotic-filled pig or chicken. But then we go with our civilizing mission there and say, no, you can't eat turtle. Turtle is a charismatic animal. Yeah, I would not eat a turtle. And then, I could tell a whole bunch of stories of how, people go with the catechesis and they evangelize, and tell how is the correct way of being. So this is one point. The other is about this net zero and the whole, I'm super critical of the carbon metrics and how we have allowed the complexity of the nature and the environmental crisis to be reduced to one molecule, the one molecule. So once we wire a metric system in our mind, it's impossible to take that out. For instance, I always use this example. The metric system that gives us identity. I don't know how it is well embedded in UK, because as far as I've studied, only UK and USA have not incorporated fully the metric system. But the metric system was a quintessential imperial enterprise run by the French because they needed to have global standards for weights and measures for global trade. In Brazil, there were popular revolts against the kilo because we had commerce before, we had trade before, and people used as diverse weighting systems as there were civilizations and experience and community. But then something from outside came and said, this is a kilo, and was like this metal piece. And then you had to sell your fruits, your skins, the furs of animals, everything, and to make this abstract operation that there was fairness in the scales. And people revolted and destroyed the kilos, and then the imperial army sent and killed people because they were fighting the kilos. So now we are fighting the carbon metrics. Because once we say net, you are assuming that there will be offsets, that you're accepting negative emission technology, that you're accepting BECS, that is biological carbon capture and sequestration, that you are accepting equations that are being done in a world system that is fundamentally unequal. And then because the South does not have money, it will want to sell for a better price. And again, we have to sell to you, because then you can live a neutral way of life. You can be carbon neutral because somebody else is going to be cleaning up. So this is very complicated. And just the last point about just connecting with the yesterday's panel on tech for good, that a lot of those technologies that are fusioning with the digital rely on synthetic biology. I don't know how familiar you are, but this whole idea of harnessing the powers of biology and the powers of nature as the new industrial platform is the most disenchanting and spiritualizing trend I have ever seen. And so it would not make any sense to hold a festival like this and to call for the spirits and for medicine, for all the magic, if you are just seeing that we need to gene editing nature because nature is not right and it needs to be, correct to work for us.
So what I've heard running through all of these conversations is the importance of relating to the local, actually, in different ways. So we've been hearing, and local nature, which includes local humans, like the people around us. So we've been hearing about, loving the river or the tree or the forest or the local culture that you live in, loving the diversity of cultures that we find in local places which are adapted to those local ecosystems, and love, ultimately, being at the root of all our meaningful ways of relating to each other and to the world. And what I find really interesting is that in the absence of that love and trust and local culture, we create things to sort of simulate it, like transparency. Like, I don't trust you because I don't know you, but maybe if you're transparent, that'll do. It's like a replacement for the actual relationships that we could be having at the local level. Like PR, like the CEO who's trying to find a way of showing you, yes, you can trust me and invest in my company because you don't know him. But we've got this substitute for trust, which is called PR. Or arguably like the law, if we don't actually trust each other and know each other and relate to each other and act with respect, then we've got this law that we can sort of fall back on. And so all this kind of solutions that everyone's been talking about, I think, have been about rediscovering what it is to relate locally to local people, to local cultures, to local land, to local non-human friends, non-human beings. And so I have a question for all of you now, which is that because of this conversation, we haven't really left time for Q&A, so we want you to relate directly to us. We're here, local to you. So if you want to come up and have conversations and take things forward, then please do. But we've got just a couple of minutes left. So there's an invitation. If there's anyone out there who's got one thing that they feel like it would be really helpful for everyone to hear, then use a little discernment and try and find that. Or if there isn't that one critical thing out there, then we'll close it here and we can start all the wonderful, informal, fertile conversations that we're going to take forward as human beings relating to each other. So, yes. So how can we start think and do hubs like Farhana was talking about?
Well, thank you. That's what I didn't say, and I should have said. And the excellent question, which I didn't plant in the audience, because I'm not sure I... So Camden is committed to rolling out Think and Do in Camden. So when I get back tomorrow, we're starting to prepare our story. And some of my colleagues want to prepare a sort of toolkit and give it out. And I'm very resistant to that. I'm saying, well, let's just share what we did. And, you can go away and use that experience. You can use some of the things that we did. And if they're useful, go ahead and do it. But, yeah, you can go out and identify before our story comes out and you want to know more. Go and identify your council. Ask them, your council. It's a very good place to start. It's where power is most local. It's where you have, the ability to walk, talk, meet the very people that you live with. This is essential. It's often what's been missing in our politics, is go and talk to them and see, especially now, where are all of the empty premises? Yeah? where are all the empty premises? Can you use existing libraries? Next week, we're going to have the first pop-up Think and Do in our local library. So the intent was, can the library give us some of their space? Can schools give us some of their space? All of them is yes, 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 by the way. Lots of businesses have said, we'd be happy to lend our cafe, or the first floor is empty every week on a Tuesday. Go and find your spaces and work with then the people who need to be there. Quite often they won't turn up, so you have to go out and make sure that you are representative of your community. That's 2 big steps that you can do without any further guidance. And that's called radical inclusion, to find the people who are not there, to understand why they're not there, to go to their spaces where they're already having meetings and talk to them about your own agenda. And this is part of then the radical decolonization, the removal in our own heads of who we see as having valuable experience and who we see is the person who will help make decisions with us, who will be on that journey with us. So I'm a very, my legal hat is more as a process and a design expert and as a facilitator and as a creator, essentially, of coalitions and alliances. And this is what I see right now. I've never created an alliance and coalition that is really rooted and that really involves everyone meeting equally for the first time and recognizing each other as equals. That almost never happens. It's nearly all the white people who make decisions locally. It's nearly all the white people who use nature, actually. So that is another story. Ecocide did last year, black people in green spaces. The whole of England, I feel my story is I love England more than England loves me, and I've had to find ways in which I can speak to that truth and find think and do spaces in nature to learn our relationship, all our stories and connections with the land. But very happy to talk to you afterwards, and I'm around all day. So yeah, carry on the invitation to all of you to do that.
Well, thank you, Farhana, and thank you to this whole amazing panel, and thank you to all for being part of it. Oh.